Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. I know it's the last panel of a panel-full day, but keep your attention here just for this last panel, please. My name's Reitz. I am professor at Hult International Business School, and I have some amazing panelists here. They're all leaders that have needed to and continue to need to transform their legacy companies in order to succeed in an era of ecosystems. So they're going to share some experiences with us, some really important lessons learnt. We're going to talk about things like flying the plane whilst you're still building it. We're going to talk about purpose and meaning. We'll talk about strategy and execution, and we'll talk about mindset and customer needs. So, let me just go through the panel who I have here. I have Lisa Hershman, who is performing the duties of Chief Management Officer for the US Department of Defense. I have Michael Joseph. He's Chairman of Kenya Airways and CEO of Safaricom. I've got Helmut, Chairman and CEO of AVL List, a global engineering and technology company. I have Ralf Wintergerst, Chairman of the Management Board and Group CEO of G&D, a German technology company. And I've also got Reto Isenegger, Global Strategy Consulting Leader at EY Advisory. So, some excellent panelists with loads of experiences to share. But before we go to them, I like a challenge. So just because Slido didn't work quite as it was supposed to this morning, doesn't mean that it won't work now. So could you please go on to Slido on your phones, please? So go into Slido. There's the slide.do, #GPDF19, and you will see a poll there, hopefully, and you'll see it on screen. And it's asking you to name one key thing that prevents an organization that was not born digital from succeeding in an era of ecosystems. Many thanks, 100%. Lack of leadership capacity, inflexible or stuck organizational culture or mindset. Maybe it's the inability to balance business as usual and innovation. Strategy and purpose is there, if you want to select that. Weak relationships with competitors, suppliers, and other providers. Or perhaps it's just misunderstanding customer needs. So if they're all important, I know they're all important, if you had to choose one before you even heard anything that the panel has to say, which one would you choose? So culture and mindset at the moment is looking like one that's resonating with the audience here. Challenge. And this flying the plane whilst building it as well, balancing business as usual, the legacy organization, plus developing and building and innovating. Okay, we'll let that run for a couple more minutes, and whilst we do that, I'm going to turn to the panel. So I've asked the panel members to just give us literally about 3 minutes, so it's a bit of a challenge, a little bit of context on your organization and ecosystems, and some of the key messages that you've got for the audience in this particular subject area. So, Lisa, shall I start with you?
Well, thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure to be back at the Drucker Forum, and this is a very timely and topical subject for me in particular. Let me tell you a little bit about my role. at the Department of Defense. If you think about the DoD as probably one of the largest, most entrenched bureaucracies in the world, and the Office of the Chief Management Officer has only been around since February 1st of 2018. So think about, I get to have a startup right in the middle of this huge bureaucracy. So the challenges are interesting. There's a lot of learning to have happen. My role in particular is the only role in the Department of Defense that is statutorily required to have at least 7 years experience of industry from outside the government, so industry experience, specific to having large-scale reform background. And so what they're trying to do is drive the message that we need to look more at outside of government and the way government usually does things, and think more about what industry has done and how do we adopt some of those practices. I want to key off the title of the presentation today. It says, how are you driving change in your company? And I will tell you, when I started at the DoD, I had to get my head wrapped around, is it actually a company? So I started with data, and I have the privilege of having the first ever Chief Data Officer that reports into me. Part of my other responsibilities include transformation and reform. We've got all the business operations that I run for the Department of Defense. If you think about budget, we have about a $700 billion budget, and I influence and manage about $168 billion of that. And when I started thinking about scale and size and how to drive reform, I had to get my head wrapped around the numbers, and I started in the area of technology. And one of the things I like to say is, when I found out that the DoD has 66 CIOs, I usually ask an audience, how many of you think that's too many? And usually most hands go up. And then I tell everyone that it's hard for us to think of ourselves as a company because we have the 20th largest economy in the world. Now how many think 66 is too many? When you think about the number of endpoints, we have 2.9 million employees. In our office alone, the Pentagon, we have 26,000 people that show up to work every day. If you walk to all the halls, you'd cover 17.5 miles, and we have 284 bathrooms. So just to give you a sense of size, so now you start thinking to yourself, the number of endpoints, the number of laptops and devices and everything else, you couldn't possibly manage it with one CIO. And so thinking about the size and the scale, so you've got complexity, you've got size and scale. We certainly were not born as a digital organization, so modernization and transformation are very much part of my priorities currently at DoD.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lisa. And Michael?
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I only have two CIOs, and I thought I had a complicated job. So I'm in the unique position that I started Safaricom 20 years ago. It started almost from the very beginning as a digital organization. So I had that sort of luxury of we starting from scratch. We can invent everything and start everything and choose the best systems, although in those days in Kenya it was not so easy. And then I'm chairman of an airline that's 50 years old now, which has many legacy systems there and completely not digital. In fact, I discovered the other day that most airlines, 50% of their bookings are made online. In Kenya Airways, only 11% are made online. So the challenge is enormous to convert a old legacy company, not so old, only 40, 50 years old, to convert it into a digital company. And this has been the challenge of running one company which is relatively flexible and digital, and then going to an airline which by its nature is one of the most highly regulated industries in the world, and trying to digitize that airline and following all the regular compliances, not over of Kenya, but also you have to follow the FAA compliances because we fly into the US, the European regulations. So all of this makes it very complicated. So But I don't think it pales into insignificant with your job for sure. So maybe we'll expand on that later. I think the other thing that we've done in Safaricom, which maybe many of you know, which is this very unique product called M-Pesa, which allows people at the base of the pyramid to have financial services on their phones. And we started this in 2007, so it's purely digital. And we've grown this financial services product now to 18 to 20 million people today using it every day and moving $2.5 billion a month through the system. So 40% of every single transaction in Kenya goes through M-Pesa, and that's completely digital. So that we have the experience of both worlds. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Helmut, how about you?
Well, our company maybe started with digitalization quite early. If you take math simulation as a good step into digitalization. So I'd like to more focus on the engineering side of it and what it means for the engineer of today, how to work in an environment where all the digital means we have of math simulation, of digital testing, of data evaluation the right way, how can you best get to propulsion systems which are really up to speed and meet the future requirements, not only that legal, but also to be extremely attractive to the customers. And how to go from originally an engine company to a company that covers all areas, battery electric, hybrids, internal combustion engines, and fuel cells in a very positive way. And in a way where we can share with other people and share with our customers. We live from a network of customers worldwide and also of project execution, partly close to the customer and partly in our headquarters and other centers of excellence in Germany and some other countries. The key is, in the end, for us to be technology-wise leading. When you're leading, you need to reach out and see what, when you look at the limits of science, can you really achieve? What's possible? Once you know that's possible from theory, and you look at today's technology, you can really come to the conclusion it is possible. And then you make the research with much more excitement. And we do this by using the science, simulation, and really go for it. And so we can reach very demanding goals to meet future, let's say, not only emission requirements, but also CO2 requirements, etc. For all these devices. That's key, because we need all those devices I mentioned to cover the future. And for our company, it's key, as I said, to be leading, but also to be very customer-focused and also see the user, which the customer needs to please the aims of the automotive industry, for instance, or vehicle industry in general.
Lovely.
So it's quite a network, and we need to have a very digital approach to all the resources we have to put them to work and to put them into projects and to evaluate the projects the right way and monitor everything, both from the logistic point of view, but also from the technology point of view.
Okay, thank you. And focus there on the customers, which we'll come back to, I think. Okay, thank you. Ralf.
Yeah, well, to explain of what journey we are taking, probably explain quickly of what we do, to then explain the challenge we have. And I'm not sure whether you all know what G&D is doing, but I'm very sure that you have some products of us in your pocket, in your wallet, or in your mobile phone. So actually we are active in 4 fields. The first thing is that historically we come from printing physical currency, which is what the title of this panel is, a legacy business. I prefer more the title existing business, because it's a very nice business to be in, printing currency. But also we are involved in electronic payment system, in the issuing services for commercial banks, but also in mobile payments. The second field we are in, we were one of the early inventors of the SIM card, so the card you put into the mobile phones. And today you find very different technologies how to actually do that. The so-called eSIM is an embedded version of that. And that business model for us is very different. For a physical chip, you pay an invoice. For a digital business model, you get licenses, you get activation fees and stuff like this. So we are in very different fields here. The third pillar is that we do governmental ID documents, passport, driver's licenses and stuff. And government go very much e-government. That's a very big trend. So we are actually facing a lot of challenges when we go through with customers through their documentation processes, that they actually ask, well, can you do this? Can you do the driver's licenses also digital? And can you connect to our national databases, which is a very different business. And the fourth thing we do is we protect digital infrastructures. When our Chancellor Merkel in Germany sends classified document to somewhere else, we provide the crypto technology that those cannot be read by somebody else. We hope that holds, right? Because a lot of people look into that. So, and you see from what we do, we are with one foot in the physical world and we are with one foot in the digital world. And that, of course, provides a lot of challenge for the existing businesses, because existing businesses are still good. But for all new businesses you want to build in the digital world, you need people, you need capital, and you need skills. And they may be very different to what actually you need in the existing businesses. So, and we decided a very conscious package of things in order to shape that. And some of those were also on the voting thing here. But personally, for me, the strategy part only got 10%. I was quite disappointed, because I think without a strategy, you have no idea where you go. I think if you don't know where you go, how can you change the culture? So for me, strategy, practically speaking, is the basis of what we do. And then, and I would certainly agree, it's a much tougher thing to crack the culture. But you must have a line of how you things forward and how you allocate the resources to build existing, but also new businesses. And I think I leave it here for a moment, Megan.
Thank you. It's a really important point, that kind of label of legacy.
Yeah, it's not so nice.
Yeah, how is that perceived and inside your organization? If
Actually, I couldn't say that.
Other?
I couldn't say that. People would be very upset if you only talk about the new stuff. People in the existing business turn upset, and you don't want them to be upset, because they still do good things and they provide also returns and existing business, right? So we have to find good words for this.
Yes, thank you. And Reto, you know, as a strategy consulting lead at EY, you must work with hundreds of organizations that are going through this challenge. So tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Absolutely, but perhaps, you know, this kind of outcome is not that unusual, so I think it's a fair representation of what we see. But before I speak about others, perhaps it's better I speak about EY itself, because we are in a transformation mode since quite a long time as well. So I think I start with that. And at EY, we are a professional service firm doing audit, tax, legal, corporate transaction, and consulting. And you see already from that kind of breadth of services, it's quite broad. And it's around 280,000 people. So basically, when we go back to the title of this session, and that's another reason why perhaps I'm sitting here, my gut feeling is I don't like to be called a legacy business. But we have definitely roots historically back to 1849. So basically, I don't match the criteria of a digital born, which in the subtitle says, you know, it's the one to be challenged as a traditional business. However, you know, I would say we are digital. You know, we are advising our clients to become digital. We are reinventing business model for our clients. You know, that's what you referred to. And I think that's the first point I would like to make. To be born digital and to be digital are two different things. You know, that's the first point. To the other one is the ecosystems. You know, you won't believe it, but in professional service firms, you know, when I started my career, it was project-based. You did a project, you delivered, you went out. Today, I was 10 years in line management. I came back. Totally different situation. Ecosystem is everywhere, you know, and all shapes and forms, basically in our industry. Collaboration, especially in technology, consulting with Microsoft, SAP, and even more creative, you know, the co-creation with our clients. We are building new business model with our clients together, and we're orchestrating those kind of ecosystem. Co-funding, because these kind of endeavors cost a lot of money. And last but not least, and we discussed that this morning, I think on the value capturing of ecosystems, competition. Much more, we are having the same partners in one of the kind of client work. Temporarily, we cooperate. In the other situation, we are in competition. I think this gets quite standard. That's a new development. Now, when I see that, and I come back to EY at the time, I would say I would agree completely with the top 2 ratings. However, when you ask me what is the one thing that drives us into transformation and the situation where we are today, and in a modern way, we tackled it with the other one, the purpose. Because the question is, if you know this is the issue, number 1 and number 2, how are you going to tackle it? What are the measures, the means? And we defined in 2013 the purpose, build a better working world. And there are 2 things in it, and then I close. One is the better. That's basically every day you need to have to do a better world, which means transformation mindset and culture. And the other one is building a better working world. You can't do that alone. You need to collaborate, connect, and use the ecosystems. So I agree with the outcome. We tackled it differently.
Lovely, thank you. Let me turn.
Can we disagree with that?
You can definitely disagree. I'm up for disagreement. So we'll turn to you next, Michael. Looking at that as well, looking at what the audience are thinking, I'd like to delve a bit deeper into, do you agree with this? In your experience, what would have been the thing that you would have focused a little bit more on, perhaps, up here? Go on.
So my experience has been in having come into an organization that's required to be digitized and leading an organization that is somewhat digitized, but leading it to the next level. I don't think the people are a challenge. I don't think people's minds are a challenge, because once you set the goal, I think people will embrace it. And if they see how it changes even their own company and the way they work, I think the biggest stumbling block is leadership. Is leadership from the top to understand what is required when you talk about digitization. It's not just having a company that operates digital devices or sells digital things or digital products and services. It's actually digitizing internally the whole company. And I think that requires strong leadership to say, I want to digitize my company. I want to digitize all the products and not all the systems and processes that we have inside the company, to digitize them so they're not manual, and they eliminate all the stuff that is absolutely unnecessary and automate them. And I think that's requires some leadership to change the whole structure of a company.
Can I just ask, though, what do you mean by strong leadership?
Okay, that's a difficult question for me. It's not a difficult question for me to answer. It's an easy question to answer, but it's not a popular question. Popular answer is if you want to really have strong leadership, you have to set the tone and you have to demand that it happens. When you look at how digital squads work, and I heard something about it this morning about flat organizations, I don't believe that flat organizations just work per se. I think you have to exhibit strong leadership in terms of setting the goal of what you want to achieve and when you want to achieve it by, and demanding that target is met. Not just saying, okay guys, this is a nice thing to do, we all equal. I think I heard somebody say this morning, we all managers, none of us are better or lower than the other. I don't believe in an organization. Now, maybe I'm biased because I'm talking about Africa, which has a different mindset to some extent to change the way we do things. In Africa, we tend to love the status quo, and it's very difficult to get people to move out of the status quo and their comfort zone. So I have what I call a cricket bat style of management.
You heard it here first.
You do what I say, or I'll hit you over the head with a cricket bat. So that's, okay, not physically, okay, not really. But nevertheless, that's the kind of leadership you have to, if you want to take an organization in an African context and make it purely digital.
Okay, I bet somebody on the panel has something to say.
Yeah.
Ralf.
I'm thankful that you mentioned Africa, because I absolutely don't believe that hierarchy solves all the problems and leadership only. And it's always a mix of things. And well, everybody has a different context, so I can probably explain it best in my own context. So what we're doing with several things at the same time. I think a strong team makes a lot of difference. I think if you have a strong leadership team, that's the part I probably fully agree. You must have a team of strong, coherent people who want to move something forward. The second thing is you must also have the right structure. 4 years back, we were a conglomerate of all the things I mentioned earlier before. We separated that into individual units which have full responsibility for their business. So we delegated a lot of authority to the businesses. At the same time, we focused them. We focused them so that they can do their job and focus on their business, but not left, not right, in particular for the existing businesses. And at the same time, we created something which we call a corporate development fund, which is a fund next to the money the businesses get for their investments. So they have money for R&D and capital expenditure, and next to it we put a corporate development fund for building new digital businesses. For building those new digital businesses, I felt I'm probably not the best decision maker, because simply I also come from the legacy business. So I had to take a very big distance, and I can force things, but I had to take a very big distance to how do we come to good decisions in creating new businesses where we have practically not so much experience. And that was a big challenge because in the existing businesses where you know the stuff inside out, you always have something to say. In the new areas, you have to hold back because maybe others are a little bit wiser than you are. Right?
Okay.
And that was where we changed also the tone on how we were talking to each other and how we were coming to decisions. And so it was a combination of leadership, of team, of structure, and of separating things to leave it space. So it's a combination of the factors up there, which for me have almost equal weight. And somehow we have to come to a position that we master it in parallel. Because if we leave out one thing, it will fail.
Okay, thank you. And Lisa, you know, again with an eye up there on what the audience has initially thought on this subject and what you're hearing, what would you say is a trap or something that you've learnt?
Well, just a comment on what my colleagues were talking about, and Michael, by the way, you're not in too much disagreement with the audience, because if you think about culture being a byproduct of leadership, that's where there's the synergy between the two. And I have found, especially coming to DoD, one of the first questions I was asked by the Deputy Secretary of Defense was, a lot of people say we need to change our culture. What do you think? And I said, I think the culture is our greatest asset because it is unbelievably strong. I can walk in and I can pick anybody that works at the Department of Defense and ask them who the customer is, and I get the same answer. And that's not all, my time in the private sector, that was not always the case. Sometimes we'd confuse stakeholders with customers, et cetera. So there's the strength. I said, instead, change your policies, your practices, your metrics, your processes, but find a way to leverage and strengthen the culture. And Ralf, I think at what you said, it's not just about leadership, but it's also the responsibilities of the leadership in terms of setting the vision, making sure the infrastructure's in place, providing the resources, which includes priority. Many times we think of resources as dollars and people, but it's also priority. But I would say, and getting specifically, Megan, back to your question, I think one of the biggest traps is that we think about success in terms of outputs, and we need to shift to outcomes. And I don't think we necessarily have, outputs are a little bit easier to measure. Outcomes sometimes are not. I'll give you an example that I think everybody can relate to. What you may not know, by the way, this morning when the slide went up with all the different ecosystems, it had people, it had medical, it had, and I'm sitting there going, yep, we got that one, we got that one, we have that one. We have a very large hospital system within the Department of Defense. We used to measure a successful knee replacement by the length of a suture, which was not uncommon in the private sector. Now we measure by how many days it takes to walk. So I think if you think about what are the outcomes, and leadership has to set the priority and express those outcomes so that everybody can relate to it, I think not having that up front is important. And it also prepares for the shift in that, and part of that is if we don't think about how our outcomes are, we won't think about how to change our processes. And if you automate a bad process, you just get bad results faster. And so rethinking the outcomes, deliberately designing towards those outcomes is very powerful. And I will add one more thing. We do a very good job at designing for an outcome, but we get through the transition and then we say, job well done, and we forget about the adoption. And that adoption means sometimes taking the old way of doing things away. And so that's sort of under the big umbrella of defining outcomes and creating an implementation plan accordingly.
Lovely, thank you very much. Helmut, what do you think when you look at that list and you hear the panel members with their opinions? What would you say is a trap, something you've really learnt, the one key thing?
One trap can be to be too much technology-oriented and not look at the user, not look at the customer who expects a solution, who really expects that the team embraces that problem the customer has and does everything to resolve it. That means you look upon it from a customer's and user's point of view. Maybe user sometimes better even the word than customer. And what does it mean? For instance, we have a very large portfolio of all the solutions you need to develop powertrains, to make these powertrains go into the vehicle, right to SOP, and also for autonomous driving. So that is our applications. And we have a whole portfolio of solutions. Key is that we empower people. And to empower people means you have to create units which are smaller units. They are either working on the whole solution or on a partial solution, on a subsystem or a larger system. But they all have to work together, of course. But each one also has, for their contribution, make sure they have a clear contact with the final customer, user, worldwide. Sounds very complex, is also complex, but we need to make this connection. The company, not as a company, can be successful. Like university doesn't cooperate with another university as university. They work through their departments, through their many different common research projects or development projects. So do we have a structure which resembles the structure of our customer, typically OM of a vehicle company, truck or passenger car, and make sure we have windows of communication where they can really be very close and we really work what does our user with the customer really need? What are they dreaming of? What can we co-invent to make it a better device, a more comprehensive device? Help him his development work. Is under a lot of pressure to meet time to market, SOP programs and terms, and as such, how can we support and take it from the user's point of view?
Yeah.
That combination, the user, the application, and the technology, only this gives a solution.
And I guess when we're transforming our organization, a trap is that we become so focused on what's happening internally that we take our eye off, or we're not really driven and led by that customer externally. So thank you for bringing that in.
There's a trap. You want to go ahead with him?
I was going to give Reto, go for a couple of minutes.
There's a trap that's on this list here, which is right at the very bottom.
Yeah.
Which I think is a big issue in our industry, is that, and it's this, if I remember I said that 11% of our bookings are done digitally as opposed to the worldwide 50% or maybe even 60% standard. And the challenge that we have is that we sign our contracts with our suppliers that are far too long. And so you sign contracts with big suppliers, and they're probably all in this room, SAP, Oracle, various people, but you sign 3-year contracts or even sometimes 5-year contracts, which doesn't allow you the flexibility to change them to suit what you want to do in a much shorter way. And then we don't know what will happen in 5 years' time or 3 years' time, but we've committed to that company for those periods of time. So when you want to change it to another organization that can perhaps help you digitize faster, you're trapped. And this is why I think this bottom one is quite interesting and quite severe for companies like ourselves, which have legacy systems, which have long duration contracts because you got them because they were, you got a good price discount if you signed a long duration contract. But then you're trapped with these suppliers. Not that they're bad, but they're just not flexible enough.
Yeah, right.
I won't mention names, of course,
Thank you. Reto.
And perhaps coming back to your initial question on the observation on our clients, because that's a little bit different on the choice, because we have a luxury in the UI to be a partnership. So basically number 2 doesn't hit us that much in the sense that we are deciding on long-term investments or short-term performance on our own. When I see out our clients, basically we are seeing more and more, and we discussed that this morning as well, that actually we call it the CEO duality dilemma. Actually, you should lay the foundation for the future at the same time, and you have to deliver in the next quarter results and optimize your performance. And this is not a problem, because for every problem there's a solution. And for this one, you don't have the perfect solution, you just can manage that dilemma. And I think that's the trap when I speak to CEOs. Many people, especially if they are stock listed and not privately owned, that's what hurts most. And basically managing that dilemma, it starts internally with the internal ecosystem, with a lot of tiny traps, I call that. But the sum of it basically doesn't let you change. These are things like CapEx investments are blocked for years. And when I ask, are there 70% in your core business, 20% in adjacent business, and 10% in disruptive business, not many CEOs would answer like Ralf, we have a special private equity funds for those kind of initiatives. We do that a lot with our clients, but many don't have. The budget trap, you have the rollover budget, and actually everything is fixed before you even start. During the year you have an innovation, but you don't have the budget. Next year, please. Too late. The board agenda trap. When you see and check your board agenda and see how much time you spend on the new things and really do workshop with your people, not with your board members. I think these are all tiny things, but in sum, it really slows down. So I think it's really, in our clients' world, stock listed, I would say it's number 2, what we see most.
Can I put on to Reto's point? I would share one of the points, which is resource allocation. I think the biggest mistake or trap, and I'm not sure whether we do it well or not, is to have, let's say, R&D, CapEx in the existing business, but you also need it for the new stuff. If you're nice to everyone, everyone gets a little bit, and you get nothing. And that's one of the biggest traps I feel, where you can be very wrong, because if you not give enough to the new businesses, they will not flourish. If you give it all to the existing business, you will not grow. If you give nothing to them, they will die. So it's quite a dilemma, but this is one of the pieces you somehow have to master, because otherwise you're damned wrong. You can have a good strategy, but it will not be executed.
Lovely.
So,
okay. Just a question that I guess speaks to, well, certainly speaks to the top 52% there. Some of my research is in speaking up. So I examine conversational habits. So everybody in this audience and all of us have lots of habits, and we won't go into them. But the ones that I'm mainly interested in are habits around what we tend to speak up about and when we stay silent. And perhaps even more interestingly, habits around who we listen to, whose voices count, and whose voices we discount. And if there's to be any change in culture, let alone moving into digital era of ecosystems, any change in culture requires some degree of change in conversational habits. Different people have to say different things and be heard in different ways to some degree. So a question to the panel: how do conversational habits need to change? Whose voices need to raise? Whose voices perhaps need to lower? What's your experiences in this particular area? Who wants to kick us off? Helmut.
Yeah.
Helmut.
Quite often you find also in technologies you have fashions to some extent, and fashions change over time, as they should probably. And it's key that you're always really open to all the possibilities. First, this is key. We need to look in the future, and you cannot predict research results of the future. Otherwise, it would not be research. And as such, you need to be very open and to the different potentials of each of these technologies. We have to combine often or bet on. So it's key to listen to people who come up with different opinions and give them a real chance, those who contradict the mainstream of what has been decided in a company. And they take it now from the area of technology. There are also other areas, social areas, and anything can be there. But it's key to be open, and open communication, and that somebody, as a matter of principle, gets his voice heard in a meeting, even though it is not what we, number one, count on right now. That's important. He should also get the chance to have his voice or her voice really heard, and maybe get a budget, a small one, to prove their point.
So the contradictory voice is really important.
Very important.
Actually, I was at a conference on Monday and I asked the audience there, maybe I'll ask this audience here, is recall a time in the last week when you have been challenged on your opinion. And I challenged my group on Monday. I said, if you can't think of an occasion where you've been challenged on your opinion in the last week, then you're probably quite intimidating and a little bit scary. So that's interesting. How do you help that contradictory voice when, of course, as we heard this morning as well, there's quite a lot of fear around speaking up and challenging traditional ways of working that perhaps feel safer. Thank you,
Perhaps
Michael.
just on the conversation and what you're talking about now, challenging people challenging you or challenging your opinion, which is, for me, is personally very gratifying because I love debating as long as I can win, of course. I'm very happy to debate with anybody. But in my time, I started Safaricom in 2000, and I spent 10 years building Safaricom it became a very successful company. Particularly because we were a very innovative company by design, and that we wanted to introduce many innovative products. And M-Pesa was one of those innovative products, which was, we started out with M-Pesa thinking that this would just be a product that would change people's lives for the better, but would not have a commercial impact at all. And it was quite astonishing that everybody around me, including my shareholders, stakeholders, all said, this is a disaster. It's a complete distraction from what you really do, which is selling voice and data. But we persevered, and thank goodness. Of course, if I'd been wrong, I wouldn't be sitting here. But we persevered, and we became very successful. But as we grew the company to be a mature company where you had to sort of take into account everybody's viewpoints, I decided it was time for me to step down from that role. And step down, and then somebody else took on my job and became a mature company. And I've just gone back in again, just 6 months ago. I've gone back into that company through other circumstances. And I'm now a startup again. I've decided to turn the company completely upside down. So you take a mature company that's 20 years old and decide to change everything that you've done before and change it upside down. And it's quite interesting now. You get a lot of challenges for that, of course. And I think I'm one of your people that don't fit into the category of listening properly. I don't listen. I just talk, and people just do what I say in the end. But I think it's okay. You don't last forever, of course. In 6 months' time, I'm sure I'll be gone. So you just have to. When you want to change an organization like that, you have to be prepared to be challenged and prepared to be answered and prepared to take in everybody's views, but pretend that you listen to everybody, but actually do what you wanted to do in the first place.
Straight talking. Lisa, what do you reckon? Whose voices, how do you hear different voices and deal with that?
So one of the things I purposely do is try to switch up who's in the room and who's participating, and I try to pay attention to who's not saying much and ask them to participate. And I have found that calling on someone directly may be a little off-putting, so I frame the question in the way that I ask, not necessarily, Megan, what do you think? But I'll say, Megan, what are you hearing? And that seems to give a little bit of where they can add in what others might be talking about. But I would say in general, and I mentioned in the opening that for the first time we have a chief data officer and a team now of data scientists that report into my organization. And one thing we have made a very conscientious decision and deliberate design to do is to add data into the conversations, and it creates the context. And so, especially with employees who have been with the organization for a long time, there's the habit of talking about their experience. And when you couple that with cross-functional input and everyone's experience, and then add in the data, we have found that that becomes very powerful in terms of now understanding the realm, the impact, the priority, all of those things when you combine experience plus the data.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Reto.
In speaking up, we're using that mostly first at the client side in creative workshops or in disruptive workshops, and we built around 20, 25 what we call waste-based centers to really do that, get the boards out and do that with the boards where the CEO is just a member of the team. And basically there are some rules how to play. Very similar what we heard this morning on Pixar, but this is not what I wanted to tell. When we implemented those very proudly, actually the problem was it was always booked out, but not with clients. It was actually our own teams. So we realized actually there's a big need to use exactly the same through our organization and hierarchies. And we do now our board meetings in consulting, which I'm part of it, mostly in those waste spaces, because it's like a codified approach. You go in and it's a team and it's about outcomes and not about hierarchies and input. And it's really interesting. It takes some time, it needs some trust, but actually we built something for our clients, and at the end, in the first 6 months, it was totally booked out internally. So we learned our lessons by going to that. And this is really, that's why I was very pleased this morning with the Pixar example. I think that's what it is. You have to shift the power in the room.
Yeah, shifting power. That was a big theme this morning. And again, labels have a lot to do with power and legacy. Are you belonging to the legacy organization, or are you belonging to the new and the digital?
The silo.
And how do these labels that we use set up different patterns of power in the room? Hierarchy is one thing, but of course we're great at adding different labels in addition to job titles that still create power difference and an impact voice. But Ralf, what do you say on this?
I think it's a damn difficult question. And when I heard you answering it, I think that it wasn't easy, wasn't it? So, from my own experience, I go 5 years back. We still had the very wide group board where we had all businesses included. I was not CEO at that time, and I was running a business sector. And I was always lining up with my colleagues from the business sectors when we needed to overrule the CEO somehow. Right? And when I became CEO, I said, well, I don't want to have that situation, because it was more a negotiation and compromising process in the board. And I at times felt, in hindsight, you always know better and you can be self-critical as well. It was not always to the best of the company, I think, right? So now that we have a different structure, we have different formats of hearing different voices. I think in our executive committee, we talk about more the day-to-day business, how we are doing, how the day-to-day business runs, the quarterly, the monthly reports and stuff. And in the group innovation board, we have nothing else to talk about innovation, digital business models, and how we want to move the company forward. No day-to-day business has space there. The group is very, very different. It's not on hierarchy. It is on who has something to say. So we pick the right people, we believe, the right people, right, for the right subject matter. So when we talk about, let's say, certain platforms in the security space, so we take a few experts, we take a few business people, we take international people and group them together. I'm rather silent in this, let's say, meetings, and it's very good to listen and to observe and to hear, because ultimately you come to resource allocation and you have to make yourself a picture. But I think having these different boards and groups, including the different pots for the investments, gives us and allows us space to handle the things differently without running everybody at the same pace, because some businesses are a little slower and others are much faster, and you have to handle it somehow to run with different speeds in the company. But in some way you have to organize for that and prepare the group so that you can have this atmosphere for here is innovation and forward, but here is tough day to day and get the problems fixed, because that's still there and you can't get rid of it, because performance still matters.
Thank you. So, a bit of a future-focused question. So what's coming? What do you have to be prepared for? What have you got your eye on now in terms of succeeding within an ecosystem? We've talked about your experiences. So what have you personally got your eye on to keep you successful in this era of ecosystems? Who would like to go first? Reto?
I think we scratched it this morning slightly about relationship and trust. I think in ecosystems, the trust factor is totally, and this connectedness, but it's totally different than social media, where basically you click on it and then basically you are connected. In ecosystem, I think the trust becomes a very important piece. You know, when we did a banking study, the youngsters, the digital natives, they said, you know, in banking, hip and cool for us are the neobanks, the fintechs, then the technology company, and then the banks. Bad news for banks. However, when the question was in with youngsters, who do you trust your money to be managed? They said first banks, then technology companies, then fintechs. So I think the component of trust is something we very much in ecosystem we have on our radar screen, and it cannot be only a blockchain technology which gives us a certain certainty of certain transaction. I think it's much more. So the trust factor, I would say, is something to watch out.
Oh, gosh, we could have a whole panel on trust and how you develop and build that. But that's really interesting that that's come into the discussion. Thank you. What have you got your eye on, Lisa?
So I think from an ecosystem standpoint, we want to make sure that we've properly identified all of the components of the ecosystem. Again, going back to the scale and the complexity, what we want to make sure is that nothing is forgotten or left out. And I think a little bit of what Ralf was saying in his point is there are some areas that might go very quickly and others that might not move as quickly, and orchestrating that and being able to manage it while you're aligned around a single outcome. And I think additionally, thinking about part of that ecosystem, not to forget outside your walls, because we have a heavy reliance on our vendors in the industrial base. And so ensuring that they are included as part of that ecosystem, whether it's a primary or a secondary or even a tertiary part of the ecosystem, I think we need to make sure that we align and even partner with them as part of the modernization or the transformation.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I think about in my environment, and now I'm talking about now a Kenyan environment, and by looking ahead, I'm a bit, to some extent, fearful, and another thing, confident about the future. In our environment, you know, where we are going so much into the digital world, where all of our people, the population is becoming digital aware, getting hold of smartphones. Smartphone penetration is still in the 40%, so we still have a long way to go to get to the 70 or 80% for the rest of the world. But I think when we get to that total digital world where everybody has a smartphone, I start to get worried about the social impact of that smartphone, particularly in our environment where every 5 years we go through an election in Kenya, and every 5 years it becomes really troublesome and tension because of social media that really creates artificial crises, and in some extent, like in 2007, a lot of violence. And I'm a bit worried about that openness of the platforms now that are all very open. You can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want without any control. What will that happen to us in 5 years' time? Or in our case, in 3 years' time when we have our next election. So I'm worried about that. I'm a bit fearful about what the digitization is going to do for us as a country. But then I'm also, what is the potential for digitization to change the way we do business in Kenya? Politics, social services, health services, educational services will change dramatically because of digitization for the better. So there's two things that I say will happen to us in the next 5 years because of digitization. And I think we have a huge potential. You know, if you look at the development in Africa, when the first development was probably the Industrial Revolution, then the steam engine, then the motor car, and then mobile phones. And mobile phones was the big revolution that came to Africa in 2000. And it changed dramatically the whole of Africa, the way we work, the way we socialize, politically, socially, in every sphere. In every sphere, it changed dramatically. So what's going to happen in the next 5 years? I think we have some exciting times ahead of us.
Thank you. Thank you. Ralf.
Well, I think it's probably a little repetition of what I said earlier, but there are three things going through my mind. I think we are in pretty cool fields as a company, right? Payments in the digital world is a very big thing. Secure connectivity to the network is a doorstep to Internet of Things. Identities, in particular digital identities, become a very important thing in our societies. and protecting digital infrastructures, that's 4 very cool fields. So what's the issue? Making the right strategic choices. Big opportunities can also mean big failures, so you must make the right choices. And in that context, there are 2 further things. So how do we build the company for the future from an architectural standpoint? And what is, let's say, the mindset of that company? So how do we stay flexible in a world that is very fast in some areas, very slow in other areas? That must somehow go hand in hand. I think you can easily determine a strategy, but how you actually move on with your organization and the people and the mindset of the organization. So running this company in the future will have a few challenges in making the right choices, building the right architecture, but also moving on with the mindset we have today, because we can't stand still. That's probably where I have put most my eyes on.
May I ask you a question? I'm just curious then, do you worry about burnout?
Me?
Yeah, and your organization, if you're in a constant state of change,
Well,
how do you reset the culture to be mindful of a constant state of change and not burn people out?
maybe
It's
for
something I think
maybe
about.
sometimes for myself, but no. But I think as we structured it in little boats, I think it's very different now, because the boats focus on their business, and if there is something to be fixed, they have to fix their boat. If they can't make it on their own, we help them. Nobody likes help, right? So everybody is doing it. So you can do many things more in parallel. So as a CEO, I can concentrate much, much more on how we further build the architecture, how we build support services, and where we shift the resources gradually too. And if we do that but I can't do that on my own, right? And as I said earlier, often in that situation, hierarchy isn't working alone, so you have to use the wisdom from the organization. And decision making, you have to find good routines to make good decisions, because if it is getting so wide and so complex, there must be different mechanisms, and I haven't cracked that really.
Yeah, it's a good question, and how we, we're doing so much, but how do we have that view down on what we're doing, so that we're making choices that are the right ones for us, and we're noticing how we're working, so that we're avoiding some of those other traps that are related to burnout. Thank you very much, Helmut.
I think it's a lot about ecosystems. It's a great word. We heard a lot of good statements today, this morning. And I think there's a lot of truth in it, because in ecosystems you are a lot together with equals, as from an organization point of view. You have to arrange, you have to make plans together. We are, for instance, strongly involved in European research programs as a company. For many years have been so. And we also, for instance, were involved for the last 10 years in the largest software systems for embedded software and large software systems for safety and security critical and autonomous systems. And there you, with about 80 different companies involved, we had the privilege to coordinate that. But this means we have a generic goal to bring the system and its properties and its characteristics and its generic properties, advance it, but it has at the same time to serve many, many different applications that all have their voice. And there you learn a lot about the future, because you work on something that is also similar for other people, even though you look upon it from a different standpoint. But the generic thing you do must stand up to all these requirements. So you get a wiser, more focus on the essential that way, which is generic and can be applied by everybody in their application. This we find in more and more systems today. That's also how. The other aspect, I think, is simply there's no recipe than talking to our customers. Our customers are happy to listen to questions as long as we are open to their needs and we come up open with what we see solutions might be. We get excellent feedback and the chance to express ourselves and find best common ground. Because they worry as much as we do, where will we stand in 10 years from now?
Yeah. So in an uncertain world,
Yeah.
looking forward, make sure you are absolutely alongside, arm in arm with the customer and the customer's needs is again a theme you're bringing in, which is very important.
And go to conferences often, and often not the very big ones, because the big ones nobody dares to talk up sometimes. But the smaller ones, where people then create a community in 2 days, they can be very open. It can be really fun. So we try to do many conferences with, by definition, are smaller, like 200 people or so, on a certain topic.
Yeah, thank you.
That opens up for everybody.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the panel one final question, and then I'm going to ask the audience, just to check they're still there. At the end of this as well, I'm going to ask, well, hopefully, I'm going to run a final poll. But here's my last question for you. What have you learnt on this panel? So what would you like to really emphasize? What did you really disagree with? Or what would you, what have you learned? What would you emphasize? What would you not emphasize that you've heard on the panel? So who is ready to go? I'm looking for some eyes. Reto.
Playing the ball forward. I think I would pick Ralf's passion about driving traditional business forward. You know, and you mentioned it at the beginning. You had the starting quote where you say we should call it legacy system, and I think we should not. Digital born is always like binary meant as good. Traditional business means difficult. I think we should have that passion to drive that forward and play with all that competitive advantage traditional businesses have: scale, trust, relationship, client. So basically, if I would pick one where I say it's perhaps missing on this list, or perhaps it's commingled on number one, it's this passion and the proud of a traditional business and this move forward. Even if you risk to be sometimes, and it was your question, ahead of your skis, as a Swiss would say. But you know, important is you have some movement forward, and I think that's my takeaway.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Helmut?
I very much agree. Passion is key, of course. We want to accomplish something. We want to move things forward. And then the other side, the thing is to really see what science can offer you. And I say science to orient our technological view also based on science. It's important to that combination.
Thank you. Michael?
I think one of the things I appreciate is that many times we think of digitization, modernization as a separate project or a program, and bringing in the ecosystem conversation has woven it into the fabric of everyone's management style and day-to-day, and I think every one of the panelists was very passionate about that, and you can see the commitment. One of the things that I took as a takeaway, Helmut, was the statement that you made about the personalization. And how do we look at the user specifically and personalize the experience, but without creating too much variation in that it then creates too much complexity. So that's something I'm going to continue to think about.
Thank you.
So Lisa said everything I was going to say.
You've got to say something because we've still got time.
Sit next to each other.
Okay, but I'll say something facetious. It's amazing that we are all digital leaders, but we're all using manual systems up here, analog systems, paper and pen. Isn't it amazing? Well, except for me, of course, who's the oldest guy here. So I think, okay, just to be less facetious and more serious. I think that what I've learned here, and is unusual for me, is to listen a little bit more about how we can take, as you said, not just digitization by itself, but the whole organization. How can you make the whole organization work towards your goals? Going from not a legacy company, but from an old company into the modern era, and to listen more and to bring all the elements of the company together.
Okay, thank you. Wow.
Yeah, I think In my talk, I didn't mention much the customer, but you mentioned it actually. And I think customer, of course, should be somehow in the forefront. But the general point probably is, I think we're all in different organizations, and organizations need to find their own success formula. But I think somehow the ingredients are always the same. Because points you mentioned, I find back in what I do, and eventually vice versa. And these success formulas, how you actually bring the pieces together to make the architecture of the firm, the mindset of the firm progressing, that's the value of a panel like this. So therefore, I want to thank my panelists, colleagues here, and fellow panelists for your input as well.
Okay, thank you. Please.
What I liked that we had very different views coming from different angles. This again is the common ground we have is the essential. And coming from different directions, it's a good way to look at it. Lisa, you mentioned complexity, and you were a little worried about it. I think digitalization in today's world, dealing with big data, dealing with all the areas we have, the one thing we learn to do much better today is deal with complexity. And don't forget, the complexity is another side of many degrees of freedom. And if you capture the degrees of freedom and put them right, you can deal with complexity at the same time. At least with a good chance. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, in a technical wizardry moment, oh, look at that. I would like to ask the audience another question. So you've listened to some experiences from the panel members up here, all very experienced in shifting and moving legacy organizations into the era of ecosystems. We're voting already. So as a result of listening to the panel, if you had to choose one area, and they are all important ingredients that all need to come back. But this is the question for your organization, not generically, not generally, abstract. For your organization, what do you think you would take away from this to really, really focus even more on? And I'll invite my panel, if there are any comments when you see this, we'll end on those comments. So leadership has gone, way up the ranking, hasn't it, as a result of listening in on this conversation. That's interesting. And we're talking more about leadership tomorrow in one of the panels, which is good because leadership means absolutely everything and anything to everybody. So we'll try and maybe get under the skin of what does leadership capacity actually mean in order to transform and succeed. The culture and mindset is still pretty important up there. Purpose, balancing business as usual and innovation, and at the bottom, but still with some votes, these external relationships with competitors, suppliers, and other providers, and the customer needs. Any final last comments from our panel on those? Any surprises there? Any questions that it raises for you?
It's a bit more balanced.
I think it was interesting to do before the session and then after to look at it again, the context and then what maybe the takeaways were from the audience, not to presume too much, but this is fascinating. It's helpful, too.
Thank you. Okay, I think we will close there. So to the audience, I guess, if those are the things that you need to focus on, they make very good questions to bring into the conference day tomorrow. What does it mean to develop leadership capacity required to transform and succeed? What do you actually do? What do you spot in a leader that will enable you to succeed and transform? And that might be a question that we take into everything tomorrow. But I would like to thoroughly thank my panelists for coming up with some different ideas and agreeing and disagreeing and hopefully giving you lots of ideas to take forward for your own organizations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.